I'm Savannah. I call myself a redeemed codependent and controller fixer. Let me start the story in November 2020 when my husband found God again and his sobriety again. My husband, David. Oh, okay. I'm grateful because it was then my life drastically changed. The trust we lost was rebuilt, and seeing his change was a miracle. But I was still emotionally a wreck. I was disassociated from the ordeal and unable to heal. Even 2 years after my husband's sobriety, I still struggled. LifeLab showed me I had a problem. I realized I was letting myself be controlled and was in a perpetual cycle of being controlling and burning out. What put me over the edge this time was a difficult reconnection with a distant family member. At the same time, my middle son had a series of seizures again, and it felt too much. I had so much guilt that I didn't manage my son's lifestyle, which causes his seizures, false guilt, I should say, over my dad's responsibilities he left behind after passing away, guilt that I'm not living up to my mother's expectations, guilt I'm not managing my life well despite knowing God, and guilt that I am not the mother my kids need me to be. For the first time in my life, I admitted I needed help. I'm grateful I got invited to a codependent small group workshop, and this is my realization so far. Sorry, I'm gonna have to read it here. I had no trust, not to anyone, my husband, my parents, my church, and even my God. I trusted myself only. There was a lot that contributed to this, and majority of it was abandonment and trauma from childhood. As an adult, I rejected therapy for myself and uncomfortable in thinking too much about my past. If you had asked me before how my childhood was, I would have answered it was normal. Truthfully, it was a script I adopted from my mom. My parents were survivors of extreme poverty and didn't deal with their own traumas, didn't know how to help me or themselves. I was born in the Philippines, and since I could remember, I was left a lot with a caregiver, a friend of my parents, who now I can consider as my grandma. My parents were away for work a lot. I switched schools and moved a lot. My mom found a Pentecostal church when I was 6 years old. This was when I learned about Jesus, and I believed him with all my heart. I had significant early childhood traumas. I cut my head open from a big fall as a toddler. I was in and out of hospitals. I had 2 drowning incidents. In 1990, I was 5. A 7.6 magnitude earthquake happened when I was at home with my grandma. A year later, a volcano, if you guys know Mount Pinatubo, erupted just 25 kilometers from where I lived. My grandma and I evacuated in the back of a transport truck, and I remember being scared because I thought it would be the last time I'd see my parents. Then within a year post-eruption, I had memories of crossing raging rivers because bridges were down, and we dealt with a home snake infestation because they were displaced out of the forest. You could say I had a few incidents that gave me so much fear and anxiety up to this day. This all happened before I was 7. My mom and I moved to Saudi Arabia. My dad was already working there for 2 years. This was when I was left alone at home a lot. Isolation was scary for the first year, and I learned how to cope with it my own ways. In Saudi, women wore abayas and hijabs to cover ourselves, and I wore them young. That didn't deter men from assaulting me in public several times. And recently my mom told me that I wore the abaya young because she lost me in a mall and found me with a man who touched me. I had no recollection of this. As a tween, 3 adult men pursued me romantically. One of them was my dad's coworkers. And at age 8 or 9, we were in a vacation in the Philippines. I rode a truck with my 2 uncles, and this was when they touched me inappropriately. I hope to this day it was only that and nothing else. because I don't remember the rest of that truck ride. When I was 13, my parents decided to live in the Philippines with my grandma. I had to relearn how to live in my home country and navigate high school. It was both extremes, scared when my parents weren't there, when I needed them, and happy I was free to do whatever I want. And at 18 in 2003, my parents broke the news that we're immigrating to Toronto. I had finally built a life in the Philippines, but had to quickly accept that was over. I'm fast forwarding to being new to Canada and meeting my husband. We met online. Luckily, he was sweet and a gentleman, but I did like him too much and found myself pregnant at 19. I was more worried about being a disappointment than thinking about the life I had inside me. I was concerned about being gossiped most of all. I didn't feel safe to reach out to anyone, especially my parents. So I told David I wanted abortion to hide my shame. He agreed because I didn't really give him a choice. I was very callous, and I truly wish I was not. After a couple years of dating, David and I got married when I was 22. We had our firstborn, Edith, and then 3 years later, our son, Samuel. One day, I was feeling the guilt of my abortion. Looking at my children, I could have had an older child right there in the living room with the rest of the family. I was heartbroken for what I did to that child, not knowing what else to do. I cried out to God and asked for his forgiveness, and he did. It came over like a hug. It was comfort. It was love. I finally forgave myself because God forgave me. I wish I can say it got better from then on. Sadly, my husband had relapsed later on. I didn't understand his addiction. I enabled it when convenient for me, and I tried fixing him a lot when it was a problem. We were also struggling financially because I walked out of a job. I was deeply depressed and couldn't accept it. It was the height of my controlling ways. I hyper-fixated on my kids' activities and determined they would get a childhood I never got. Truthfully, they had an over-controlling mom. Then, as a surprise, I got pregnant with our youngest, Sloan. I convinced Dave that moving to Ottawa will fix everything. Truthfully, I was concocting a quiet divorce plan as a plan B in case I couldn't take all the lying, rage, and drinking anymore. While the move was successful, I checked out from our marriage. I couldn't even execute my plan B because I was numb. While I still prayed for a marriage and a sobriety, most days I didn't care anymore. Then, out of nowhere, when God knew I had no recent attempts and completely had no hand in fixing my husband, David came to me and admitted that he had been drinking behind my back and that he's quitting and found a sponsor. And this brings us to where this started the story. The sad truth was I was playing God. I knew him. I knew he gave up his son Jesus to make a way for all of us, sinners of all kinds. But yet I couldn't give up my whole life, my past, my traumas to him. Looking back, he was there when I was helpless in the drownings, the earthquake, the volcano, the abandonment, and the assaults. It took me 30 plus years to look at what had happened to me, grieve it, and finally be ready to fully surrender it to him. He knew that this was the perfect time to do so. The 12 steps have guided and still is guiding me, and it took my hand on a path to heal. But it is only by God's power, love, mercy, and grace that I am now able to entrust everything to him. There was no condemnation when I repented from my pride and self-idolatry. I am now able to give the guilt and shame to him because it is so much better in his hands. The peace that I have now is from the constant surrender that my life is not mine to control, but in his hands to transform.